Welcome to today's show. My name is Michael Juberg, and I'm with the Global Compassion Coalition, an online community with a mission to build a world based on compassion. Today, we have the privilege of speaking with Dr. Deanna Varley, a postdoctoral research associate at the Matilda Centre for Research in Mental Health and Substance Use at the University of Sydney. Her research is interested in understanding factors that contribute to psychological distress and how early life experiences influence mental health later in life. Thank you so much for joining us today, Deanna.
Thank you so much for having me, Michael.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. So it's so great to have you on our show. And I actually had the privilege of speaking with one of your former colleagues, Dr. James Kirby. And was he
Yeah.
one of your mentors?
Yeah, he was my main PhD supervisor, so he's a massive influence on my research.
Unbelievable. Yeah, he's such a lovely human and has such beautiful work coming out. And I just want to maybe dive into that a little bit. I'd love to hear more what you guys were working on in your PhD program.
So, in my PhD work, when I was working with James Kirby, as you mentioned, I was focusing on investigating how attachment style influences the experience of compassion later in life. So essentially, we were interested in finding out how and to what extent the way that people engage with their parents when they're young and the way that they develop those attachments with their parents have any influence on them later in life in terms of the way that they experience self compassion, the way that they engage compassionately with other people. So, both whether they are affected in their ability to give compassion, but also to receive compassion from other people as well. So it's really interesting, and we did quite a few different studies to investigate that. And we were really quite interested, especially in finding out whether there were differences across the different attachment styles, so between anxious and avoidant attachment. Yeah.
Mhm. And so it sounds like it takes a developmental slant. And how early are you studying children? I mean, are we talking very young, like infants, toddlers? At what age does your studies really pick up these attachment styles?
Yeah, so that's a great question. A lot of people in research do focus on investigating attachment in children and all the way through the lifespan, so through middle childhood and into adolescence and adulthood. Our interest was primarily in looking at how these attachment related differences manifest in adulthood. So we were really just looking at people that are kind of like developmentally adults. So we cut that off at about 18 years of age. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. And so were these largely self-reports about their attachment styles?
Yeah, so we were looking at self reports predominantly. There are quite a few validated measures of attachment. So we weren't getting too much into the nitty gritty of like observing people rather than just getting them to do the self report because that has been investigated so much in the past. But it was just mostly self report. But we did also do some investigation of like other measures of attachment when we were looking at a meta analysis. So we reviewed what previous research had been done in this space, and that included any measure of attachment, even if it was observational as well.
Fascinating. And what were some of the things that your meta-analysis found?
So, that particular meta analysis was looking at the associations between attachment style and something called fears of compassion. So, that term, fears of compassion, is something that we use to describe essentially like discomfort or kind of a sense of uneasiness or like fear in response to compassion related experiences or positive social interactions with other people. So, basically, you might have potentially experienced this before, or people in the who are listening might have experienced this before. If they've ever like felt really sad or something like that and somebody's tried to comfort them, but it's actually made them feel a bit uncomfortable. So that's the kind of experience that we were looking at. And we wanted to know whether or not there was an association between that and attachment style. And if that type of association varied between anxious and avoidant attachments. Because in terms of anxious and avoidant attachments, they are characterized by different behaviors, different patterns of emotional responses in the context of social relationships. So it would also make sense if there were potentially differences in the way that people experience these fears of compassion. But interestingly, we actually didn't find differences between anxious and avoidant attachment. Yeah.
Interesting. And could you, for our listeners, maybe break down the difference between those two attachment styles?
Yeah, for sure. So I'll start with anxious attachment, which is typically characterized by a fear of rejection. So people with anxious attachments are often quite fearful of potentially being rejected by close others, whether that might be their parents or a romantic partner, and are typically much more anxious in the context of relationships in general. So they like to typically seek closeness to others for comfort, but often are quite fearful of those people leaving them. Typically, the theory seems to be that attachment style tends to develop when the care that they received from parents early in life or caregivers early in life might have been potentially a little bit inconsistent. So it's not necessarily associated with like bad parenting or anything like that, but potentially sometimes the caregivers might not have been able to meet all of the needs of the child consistently. And so they kind of learned that love is potentially a little bit inconsistent, and they try to hold on to it really tightly because of that. In contrast, people with avoidant attachments, that type of attachment is typically characterized by actually kind of like avoiding closeness with others. So typically, they are also quite fearful of rejection, but they have a different way of handling that kind of fear than anxiously attached people might. Whereas anxiously attached people try to like seek closeness and be really close with people, and sort of like try not to let go of those that they are quite close with and attached to. Avoidantly attached people try to protect themselves from the possibility of rejection, typically by not letting people get too close to them. So you'll typically see that people like this tend to be quite hyper independent, try not to rely on others too much. And on the opposite side of the spectrum from anxious and avoidant attachment, we see people with more secure traits where they're quite comfortable in, I guess, availability of love and care from other people, and typically aren't too fearful of people rejecting them or leaving them. And they're typically able to have generally the most healthy connections with others in close relationships in their lives. And one probably good thing to note as well is that even though typically in research people do talk about attachment styles, as in like, I suppose, these categories. And previously, in the 60s and 70s, when these theories were being developed, people did actually use categories to describe attachment. But more recent research has actually changed the way that we think about attachment. We now think about it more as like this dimensional construct where you can be, varying levels of high or low in a different sort of attachment pattern. So it's important to note that one person might not necessarily just be explicitly avoidantly attached or anxiously attached. They might have a tendency to be slightly more avoidant than another person, for example, but they are not necessarily in these boxes as we previously used to believe.
That's a great breakdown. Thank you so much for breaking that down and explaining that to us. And as far as what you saw in your meta-analysis, you're kind of looking at the anxious and avoidant attachment styles, and it sounds like you reported no major differences. Is that right?
Yeah, so we didn't actually find any major differences in people that tend to be more anxiously attached compared to people that tend to be more avoidantly attached. There were, however, differences between both of those sorts of like types of attachment compared to people that are a little bit more secure. And the main differences that we saw were that quite consistently people with the more insecure types of attachment, so people that tend towards more attachment anxiety and avoidance, were reporting a lot more fear of receiving compassion from other people. And that was usually the strongest effect that we were seeing, that they were most uncomfortable with receiving compassion from others. And then that was closely followed by a fear of giving themselves self compassion. And then after that, a slightly less strong effect was a bit of discomfort with giving compassion to other people. But it was not as strong an effect as their discomfort with receiving compassion and self compassion.
Interesting. So it seems like self-compassion is a pretty important construct that kind of dovetails with how people are perhaps having fear of compassion or giving compassion. Where does self-compassion fit into that equation?
Yeah, so that's a good question because I think that it does seem to be quite closely related to the way that people feel about receiving compassion as well. And from an attachment theory perspective, what we think based on our research is that people's early experiences early in life in terms of how they engage with their caregivers and how their caregivers engage with them seem to influence their expectations in social relationships, which extends to their expectations around compassionate experiences and interactions with others, but also seems to influence the way that they perceive themselves. So essentially, like your early experiences are able to influence the way that you believe that you are worthy of receiving compassion, not just from other people, but potentially also from yourself. And it also influences the way that you see yourself in terms of whether or not you feel that you are somebody that is worthy of love. And I think it makes quite a lot of sense that if potentially your early life experiences tend to maybe give you the overall message that love is not consistent for you, maybe you feel personally about yourself like you are less worthy of love, and then that would maybe make it more difficult to be self-compassionate as well.
That's so fascinating. I'm always wondering whether or not self compassion is a trait. Is it something that, like you're kind of suggesting, is something that's picked up through environmental or social conditions, versus something that's more educational based, right? If we think about like a child's aptitude to excel in math, it's hard to know until you teach them math, right? And
Mm.
so I'm always wondering about self compassion, where it's only recently caught the attention of researchers, even in Buddhism. There's a lot of talk about compassion, but it doesn't explicitly mention self compassion. And I wonder whether or not self compassion is something that is a part of our socio emotional development, but it's not something that's natural, that it literally has to be taught, that we have to teach people this is how we view ourselves, this is how we hold ourselves, this is how we care for ourselves in a time of distress. I'm wondering what your perspective is. Do you think it's more of a trait, or do you think it's something that is more environmentally influenced?
That's a great question. And I think that I personally believe, based on my knowledge of the research and the theory, that it's probably a little bit of both. Like, I think that your environment when you're growing up really influences probably your like disposition towards being more or less self compassionate. But something else that we know quite consistently from the research is that it is a skill that you can learn and that you can develop over time. So, much like other skills, you might have like a natural level of aptitude, just like you said. Potentially, you might, be better or worse at maths naturally, right? But just like with math, if you practice, you can get better at it. So it is not just a trait that is sort of set in stone for people. It's not something that you're just born with and that's your set level of self compassion forever. It definitely does seem like it is something that you can develop over time. It just kind of requires that practice and engagement with, I guess, like the effort to actually try and builds up that skill over time.
Hmm. I really appreciate that very thoughtful answer. So, what would your takeaway be to our audience about your meta analysis? What is kind of like the conclusion of what your findings were?
I think that for me, the most interesting takeaway is that attachment, in terms of its association with compassion, is not just influencing the way that we engage with other people. Because I think that people typically think about attachment as a theory that describes the way that we interact with others and our perceptions and beliefs and experiences in relationships with others. But for me, it seemed to take away that it's not just influencing our compassionate experiences with other people, it also influences our experiences in terms of compassion with ourselves. And I think that that's a really important thing to understand is that attachment doesn't just influence the way that we interact with others, it also influences the way that we interact with ourselves.
How fascinating. I think the way we might even consider it is, the interpersonal, how we relate to others versus intrapersonal, how do we relate to ourselves? And I know that there's a lot of research that kind of connects personality variables to behavioral variables, right? And how are we in social relationships? But it is interesting to kind of turn it a little bit more inward. How our parents raised us perhaps might influence whether or not we feel deserving of compassion, whether or not we're willing to give compassion. It looks like one of your projects looks at reviewing patterns of subjective reports of distress and compassionate responding in everyday life settings. It sounds like you use a methodology known as ecological momentary assessment. Could you tell us a little bit about what that is and what your study is looking for?
Yeah, so ecological momentary assessment, or some other times it's called experience sampling as well, is a method of measurement that's been developed in the last 50 years or so that essentially aims to collect more environmentally sound data. So we're aiming to get people to report on their behaviors and their emotions in their everyday environments instead of just getting them to do one self-report scale where they're responding to just 10 questions about the way they feel or something like that once at one time point, where you're kind of just capturing potentially to some extent just the way that they might feel in that moment. And traditional self-report scales are also quite influenced by, the reliability of a person's memory. So if you get somebody to report on something more close in time to the event that you're asking them to report about, you're likely to get more accurate data. So the idea of what we were doing was that we wanted to investigate the way that attachment relates to like people's experiences of distress and the way that they engaged in terms of compassion with those experiences in their everyday lives. And we wanted to assess those things using a method that would allow us to be more sure that our data was capturing those everyday life experiences and that it wasn't as influenced by memory biases and stuff like that. So we were asking people to essentially tell us when they had experienced distress and when they'd also noticed other people experiencing distress. And then we asked them about how they'd responded to those experiences and how other people had responded to them. So, whether or not, if they were the one that was distressed, did they act in a self compassionate way? Did they have somebody else give them compassion? And if it was the case that they reported that they did notice another person was in distress, we asked them to report whether or not they had done something compassionate to try and help that other person that they'd noticed.
I think that's such a valuable way to collect data. And I think, as scientists, we always wonder as we give self reports, how does somebody think about the entirety of their life as they're looking at, 10 questions that says on a scale of 1 to 5, tick the box that represents where you're at, where something like an ecological momentary assessment really gives you perhaps the most naturalistic and real perspective of what they're doing at that exact time. But I'm sure there might be some confounds or challenges with whether or not that itself primes them to respond and to behave differently, right? If we're saying, hey, are you acting self compassionately? Hey, what about now? How does your study control for that?
I think it's a great question. Like, how do we control for that? Because it's something that is really difficult to control for. So, we did have two groups in each of the studies that we used ecological momentary assessment in. So, had like individuals who were reporting, on their compassionate behavior and stuff like that all the time. And then we also actually had a group that were also reporting on the compassionate behavior after doing like self compassionate interventions. So, we were able to sort of tease apart the effects of like the intervention trying to develop compassion. But in terms of just whether or not the ecological momentary assessment itself influences people's responding, that's something that is quite difficult to, I guess, ascertain. And something that we would like to do in future research is to try and get the same people into a new study and get them to spend a week where they're not really reporting on their compassionate behavior, but we're just getting, I guess, like a couple of more spaced apart assessments of their compassionate behavior. And we'd also like to observe them. So it's a bit difficult to do in everyday life in the same way that you would do an ecological momentary assessment, but we would like to observe them in a lab based setting and then also at the same time be getting them to do the ecological momentary assessment, potentially over a couple of hours, and see whether or not our experimental, like whether our observations of them as participants matching onto what they're reporting. That's not something that we were able to do in the studies that we've conducted already, but it is something that we'd like to do in the future to be able to control for that.
Wonderful. On some level, it almost seems like, depending on what this study finds, that actually could be a useful mental health tool to kind of have a push notification that says, remind yourself to respond compassionately, or you've been practicing that self-compassion. Don't leave it at the door when you walk out for your day, right? It could be an interesting mental health tool at some point.
Yeah, definitely. And it was something that we did talk about when we were interpreting the findings of our study in terms of whether or not just like having the consistent reminder in the form of a question, like a regular self report question that's been sent to you multiple times throughout your day, does that reminder, I guess, prompt people to be acting more compassionately over time? And I think that'd be an interesting thing to try and investigate a little bit further and a little bit more specifically in the future. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'd like to just kind of remind our audience that with any type of study, we always balance the benefits of any research design with the challenges. I particularly like ecological momentary assessment because it's in the field. It's not with a bunch of people staring at you. It's not in a room. It's not an experiment. It's as people are day to day. So something like that has tremendous potential for impact. And how far along are you in that study?
Those studies have been complete now, and they are either published or in the process of being published. So we've got a couple that are in the final stages of their peer review. And in terms of like the results that we found from those studies, it depended on which study we're referring to. But I'll start with the most simple study, which was just where we were asking people to just report their compassionate behavior in everyday life. And we wanted to look at whether or not there were differences in compassionate behavior in everyday life based on people's self reported attachment patterns. And what we found was that typically people with anxious attachments, so people who were reporting a tendency towards those more anxiously attached traits, those people were consistently reporting noticing more like times of distress within themselves and more opportunities to act compassionately. And they were also noticing other people being distressed more often as well. But interestingly, and this is in contrast to previous lab based studies of compassion, we were finding that there were no differences in the extent to which those anxiously attached individuals actually acted self compassionately or compassionately towards other people after you took into account whether or not they noticed the opportunity to be compassionate in the first place. In contrast, we noticed essentially the opposite pattern of results with those who tended towards more avoidant attachment. So, in those individuals, they were reporting less times where they were noticing distress in themselves and others, and less opportunities to act compassionately towards others and towards themselves. But the same thing as with the anxiously attached individuals, when you took into account the extent to which they had noticed the opportunity to be compassionate, there were no further differences in the actual actions that they took. So, this is sort of kind of an interesting thing where it seems like if you're accounting for whether or not they're actually aware of distress in themselves or in other people, there aren't as many differences in compassionate behavior as has been previously observed in research that's been conducted using traditional self report measures or in lab based settings where they are typically just observing the behavior of somebody in sort of that kind of sterile, simulated kind of environment.
Interesting. Well, I look forward to seeing the results or seeing the final publications.
Yeah, definitely.
And I have a question about what are some of the projects that you're most interested in right now?
In terms of future research.
Future research, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. So, in terms of future research, I feel like there needs to be potentially a big push towards more longitudinal research. So, as we were sort of touching on a little bit before when we talked about age and the fact that we were just looking at people who are reporting on their attachment and their compassionate behavior as adults, it's a little bit difficult, I guess, to infer causality because we're just asking them to retrospectively report information about their attachments and stuff like that that are based on experiences that occurred in the past. So, while we can, I guess, make like the inference that these two things are connected, we know that attachment style has a correlation with compassionate behavior. And we know that your early experiences in childhood have a correlation with the way that you are self compassionate and give compassion. we don't know whether and to what extent those things are causally related. And I think that it'd be really interesting to be able to track people across the course of their lives and know in more detail about their experiences in childhood and see whether or not people that had, specific experiences in childhood differ from people that had different environments in childhood and see whether or not those things pan out as they age and whether or not they are having those sort of, I guess, more causal effects. Yeah.
That's wonderful. And it sounds like one of the utilities of conducting longitudinal research is if you did find something over time, you might be able to even identify risk factors. Is that something that your studies have looked at before or have been able to do is identify risk factors?
That's a great question. I think that so the studies that we've done up to now haven't really been focused on identifying risk factors and I guess like those different profiles of experiences in childhood and how that relates to really different outcomes in that kind of like causal way. But it is something that some of the research that I'm involved with now in my postdoctoral research role will be focusing on in a little bit more detail, which is something I'm really excited to focus on. So, what we're going to be doing is using a lot of longitudinal data actually, and we'll be using a certain type of modeling to be able to see whether or not certain risk factors are specifically associated with certain mental health outcomes at a later date. And I think that will be able to shed quite a lot of light on that and is something that I'm really excited to see where that research goes in the future.
This has been so wonderful to speak with you, Deanna, and to learn about more of your work and your team's work. And we really appreciate you joining us today and sharing about your exciting research. I know you're a young researcher, so I can't wait to see how your career blossoms over time. But we really appreciate you taking the time and sharing your wisdom with us here. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me.
Okay.